Shifting sands in Syria as a hazy picture starts to form of a possible endgame. Is President Bashar al Assad heading for a last stand as the conflict spills into its 22nd month? This is Inside Syria. Hello, I'm Ghida Fakhry. Welcome to the program. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis in Syria have been slow-moving and largely ineffective, but events appear to be gathering pace. On the ground, rebel forces are trying to gain control of the capital, Damascus. More than 100 Arab and Western countries have now acknowledged the Syrian National Coalition as the legitimate representative of the Syrian people. The leader of the opposition is urging Syria's minority Alawite community to turn against President Bashar al Assad, an Alawite himself, facing a mainly Sunni uprising. The deputy foreign minister of Russia, a strong ally of Syria, has been quoted as saying rebel forces may win the fight. And the US is starting to plan for that. It's branded one group of fighters said to be linked to al-Qaeda in Iraq as terrorists, effectively excluding them from any future discussions. Setting the scene for our discussion on Inside Syria, here's Zaina Khadr.
Victory is still not theirs, but they believe they are close to winning the battle for Syria. The new Syria these people want is one that will be free from Western influence. They made that message clear to the Obama administration. Jabhat al-Nusra is part of us, these Syrians chanted. The US was hoping to marginalize the group when it labeled it a terrorist organization. Instead, Jabhat al-Nusra, one of the rebel fighting forces, has gained popularity especially in the villages and towns of Syria. And no one here shies away from acknowledging the group has foreigners among its ranks.
I really don't know who the leader of Jabhat al-Nusra is and whether he is a Jordanian or not. But what about its members? Aren't they Syrian? And there is no shame if our brothers in Iraq came here to help us fight. We did that for them during their war.
For many in the opposition, the international community should have labeled Syrian President Bashar al Assad a terrorist instead. Many people are suspicious of the West and Syrian politicians who work closely with them. The main opposition body in exile, the Syrian National Coalition, has gotten world recognition, but it still doesn't have the stamp of approval from all Syrians.
We won't say whether we are with the Syrian National Coalition or against them. They should be here, on the ground. Plus, we have educated rebels who can lead.
The mainstream Free Syrian Army are not their preferred choice. God, please guide the FSA back to the right path, is what they chant.
If the
Free Syrian Army remains loyal, then we won't be against it. We want Sharia law and no peace with Israel. They shouldn't compromise and fall under the West's influence.
Not too long ago, when anti-government demonstrators took to the streets, they would appeal to the international community for help. They asked them to impose a no-fly zone. They asked the world to supply them with weapons. They're no longer asking for that. What people here are asking for is the international community not to interfere in the internal affairs of this country.
The opposition is already planning for the post-Assad phase, and for these people, that won't involve any form of Western intervention. Zaina Khadr, Al Jazeera, Idlib province.
To discuss all this, I'm joined by our three guests. In London, Ammar Waqqaf, a member of the Syrian Social Club, a group advocating reform in Syria. In Birmingham, Scott Lucas, a professor of American Studies at the University of Birmingham. And joining us from Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer, political analyst and columnist at the newspaper Novaya Gazeta. Ammar Waqqaf, as more and more governments seem to be planning for a post-Assad Syria, where does President Assad's Alawite community, to which you belong, stand today? Is it also positioning itself for this eventuality?
I think people have gone into a premature joculation mode, which is celebrating an event before it's really starting. In the past 2 days, we've seen a huge hype in the media, actually, mainstream media, about what Mr. Bogdanov in Russia said, and this signaled for them that the Syrian government is going to fall down soon. And I don't think that is correct, because what Mr. Bogdanov further said, which wasn't reported very much in the mainstream media, only says that they regret that the West is pursuing the objective of bringing down President Assad's government, even at the cost of hundreds of thousands. In fact, other Russian officials like Mr. Pushkov, or Alexei Pushkov, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Russian Duma parliament, said that the acknowledgement of the opposition as a legitimate representative of the Syrian people really leaves no place for any political solution, and the only option now is war.
Well,
so
we'll get to the Russian position in just a moment, and we'll actually look into whether or not there was a shift. But I was interested in knowing whether President Bashar al Assad could be likely to lose his key support base, the Alawite community, especially in the light of the call made by the president of the Syrian National Coalition just a few days ago, calling on the Alawites to essentially rise up against President Assad, to engage in a campaign of civil disobedience. How likely are the Alawites to respond to this call?
Well, I'm afraid I can't see the Sunnis of Syria really listening to this foreignly appointed executive rather than an elected person by Syrians. This was a person who was appointed by foreign taxpayers, not Syrian electors or electorate, let alone Alawites listening to him. There is the support base of President Assad or for the central government isn't at all about Alawites, and I'm sorry to say that people are being disillusioned by this. There are a lot of Sunnis who support the central government and who do not want the central government to collapse for all sorts of reasons. The least of which not to bring Syria into a chaotic situation or becoming a failed state. I don't think that those people will accept whatever someone tells them to do from an outside, and I don't think that this person's future is going to be any brighter than that of Burhan Ghalioun or Abdul Basit Sida, who were made redundant by the same people who actually appointed them.
All right, let's explore the Russian position for a moment. Pavel Felgenhauer, there's been a lot of interest in the last few days in the statement that has come out of a top foreign ministry official in Moscow. Is Russia now also starting to position itself for what comes next in Syria, however reluctantly it might do so?
Well, actually, this was not a policy statement. This was a public discussion in the public chamber. Though, yes, there are such opinions in Moscow. Mr. Mikhail Bogdanov and, say, Senator Mikhail Margelov, the chairman of the Russian Upper House Foreign Relations Committee, who are Arabists and specialists in the region, who believe that, yes, it's time for Russia to begin to recognize the real possibility of the fall of the Assad regime and to begin to kind of work on a future policy in a post-Assad Syria, post-Assad Middle East. But this opinion is very much a minority opinion. Bogdanov was talking about that we should maybe discuss it. But the majority of the Russian elite still is very much supports the present position, and the present official position formulated by President Vladimir Putin is that we are going to back the Assad regime. We're against absolutely any forceful regime change, and that we will not tolerate and Russia will oppose any use of force to change the regime in Damascus.
You say it's not a policy position, and you say it doesn't reflect a shift. Let me just actually remind ourselves of exactly what Mikhail Bogdanov said. He, in fact, said there is a trend for the government to progressively lose control over an increasing part of the territory. And he added that an opposition victory cannot be excluded. But Russia's foreign ministry, of course, backtracked on Friday, issuing a denial some 22 hours after the statement. So despite that denial, despite that clarification, Pavel Felgenhauer, aren't Bogdanov's words a true reflection of what the Russian government now really thinks, that the rebels could prevail over Assad's forces?
Well, of course, that's recognized, that's possible, though the prevailing opinion in Moscow is that the Assad regime has still a lot of resources, that a sizable part of the Syrian population supports him, and that he may wither the storm, and if it becomes obvious to the opposition that they can't win, maybe some parts of the opposition will go for a kind of political agreement that could keep elements of the Assad regime still in power. That's what Moscow thinks should happen and hopes what should happen.
Let's look at what.
So this was not a political statement. This was a discussion.
Understood. Let's perhaps look at what the United States has been issuing as statements and perhaps signals in the last few days. Scott Lucas, the U.S. starting perhaps to position itself a little more assertively. Two important steps in the last few days: recognizing the Syrian National Coalition on the one hand and labeling al-Nusra, the al-Nusra Front, as a terrorist organization. Does this latest move, though, actually complicate the rebels' work on the ground of toppling President Assad, when you consider that al-Nusra is seen by many as the most aggressive and the most assertive and successful part of the rebel force?
Well, it's actually more than two moves. And I think to talk about Russia first, to follow on from your previous guest, what the Americans told the foreign minister, Mr. Lavrov, 9 days ago, what Ms. Clinton told him is that the Americans now assess that Assad really does not have that much longer left in power. We're talking a matter of months rather than going well into next year. Now that leads to your direct question, which is how the Americans are preparing for that. And they are trying to declare who is acceptable, who is not acceptable within the coalition. And you're absolutely right. The difficulty is that people in Syria, different groups in Syria, don't necessarily agree with the Americans. And as your correspondent's report indicated, that the fact is that a number of the insurgent groups, and we're not just talking about the al-Nusra Front, but a number of other insurgent groups have, they are supported by the people because they now are in the position of providing food, of providing protection. They control a lot of territory, especially in the north. And so I don't think the Americans can go into the position and try to be the kingmakers or, basically the makers of the next government. It's going to be a very complicated process, and I think what you're going to find is the Americans are going to have to accept that even if they're more involved, they're going to have to be alongside the Turks, the Europeans, the Arab states, and most importantly, a variety of Syrian groups who are preparing for the fall of Assad.
But what about this belated move of recognizing the Syrian National Coalition as the legitimate representative of the Syrian people? Will that change anything on the ground?
Well, it is an important step in that it at least puts out for the first time a really clear signal that the international community is recognizing what is in effect a transitional government, or what they want to be a transitional government. They never did this with the Syrian National Council. Now, not just the Americans, but European states, the Arab states, and Turkey have all said, look, we want a united opposition and we're going to back the coalition. The question now is how many groups within Syria, both politically and militarily, basically say we also recognize the coalition. And that's not going to be an answer you're going to get within the next few days, within the next few weeks. It's also something that is tied into a very important, I think, point that isn't recognized here and that is while the insurgents control the countryside, they don't control a major city yet. If they control a major city where you can place the opposition, whether it's the coalition, whether it's another form of opposition, then you've got a base, as you did in Libya when they did this with Benghazi, where you can build up support from the opposition despite the range of opinions within Syria.
Ammar Waqqaf, how important is it for the opposition to have a strong domestic base? The President of the United States says the Syrian National Coalition has earned the right to represent the Syrian people. It's earning more and more recognition internationally, but can it be seen by Syrian people on the ground as the real, genuine representative of all Syrians?
I pretty much doubt it. We need to understand that this new coalition is only a rebranding of the previous Syrian National Council thing. It's not really anything new, genuinely. And that council did not take much recognition from the Syrian people at the time. It is important for them, obviously, to get some stronghold within Syria. However, that is very much doubtful. The Syrian government seems to be playing, on the long haul here. They are not, they're quite keeping their cards to their chest in a sense. They are not going into a full-fledged conflict. Some estimates say that only about 30% of the Syrian army capability was used so far, or has been used so far. And obviously, if that is true, the Syrian government has an eye on a more wider regional conflict that may erupt any moment. So is that going to help the rebels to say, okay, well, we're gonna take a stronghold? I don't think so. There is one other important issue, is that there seems to be, a collision course here. The Americans, when they say Al-Jabhat al-Nusra is Al-Qaeda, which is interesting because they, or a terrorist organization, which is interesting because they didn't recognize Al-Qaeda until 11 years after the cessation or the fall of the central government in Afghanistan. And then a couple of days later, the coalition leaders say, no, this is part and parcel of our revolution. Then this is a sort of collision course. It tells you actually how thin the coalition representation on the ground is. They cannot afford to tell the people on the ground that we are going to say Jabhat al-Nusra is actually terrorism, because when they say so, they will lose every single support they have, which doesn't seem to be very much. The Syrian opposition, from the start of the crisis in Syria, has been all along trying to follow the street rather than lead the street. And this issue of Jabhat al-Nusra is no different, really.
Professor Lucas, would you agree with the view made by some that the US is essentially also playing for time, not trying particularly hard to break the current status quo, for fear of not finding the right credible alternative on the ground to step in to fill the vacuum should the Assad government suddenly collapse?
I think the Americans have been indecisive at times. I think they've hung back at times. But I think that it's wrong to keep focusing on the Americans. The Americans are just one player here. And I really have to disagree with your pro-regime guest in London, who's trying to present the view that, in fact, a majority of Syrians are still behind the government, that the opposition is actually a minority, that it's divided. The key point here for the Americans, for the Europeans, for the Turks, for Assad to consider is that there are many oppositions within Syria. There are some who are tied to Islamists. There are some who are tied to the Free Syrian Army. There are some who are tied to the free, peaceful protest that have occurred since March 2011. Now, that does mean there are questions about whether that opposition can unite. But it does not mean that Assad faces a weak opposition or that, in fact, he has majority support. To the contrary, the reason why we're discussing this is because Assad's position is so weak, much weaker than it was at the start of the year when he could attack the opposition and reclaim cities. He can no longer do this. All he can do now is try to hang on in Damascus and secure the periphery around it.
Pavel Felgenhauer, does Moscow think that President Assad can hang on to power for much longer? Is it betting on him being able to survive this? Because Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, just a few days ago, after the US recognized the Syrian National Coalition, expressed his surprise and said that the US was essentially betting on an armed victory of the opposition. What is Moscow betting on?
To say Moscow believes the majority opinion here is that the Assad regime still has a lot of assets and can hang on. Of course, the Russian military advisors are still inside Syria, inside the Syrian military, and Russian military specialists are helping the Syrians to man new complicated anti-ship and anti-aircraft missiles, so that Russia has an independent view of the state of the Syrian military, and apparently that view coming from the Russian military sources is that the Assad regime still can fight on and maybe can even survive in some form if the opposition sees that victory is impossible and part of it agrees for coalition talks, which is more or less the Russian policy. On the other side of it, Russia is not ready at all to intervene in this conflict in any way. Russian support for the Assad regime logistically is much, much smaller and less significant than that of Iran, which is the main supporter of the regime. So Russia is very much involved diplomatically and in the propaganda sense, but directly is not involved and does not plan to involve in that conflict at all.
But how concerned will Moscow be about the government, about Moscow losing support and losing influence in the region if the Assad government suddenly falls?
That would be seen as a major catastrophe even, because of course Russia has a small naval station in Tartus on the Syrian coast, but there are much more important things, and the most important thing is the close relationship between the Russian military and the Syrian military. The Russian intelligence services and the Syrian intelligence services they work together for many decades. It's very close embeddedness. and there's no alternative to this important intelligence gathering station and intelligence cooperation agreement. There's no other country that can step in, and we can actually, our ships can get different kind of supplies in other ports, not only in Tartus. But the close relationship with the Assad military and the Assad intelligence will be lost together with Assad, and this will be a major setback for Russia in the Middle East.
Ammar Waqqaf, how much of a setback for the Alawites would the collapse of the regime be? Have Alawites largely stood by this president out of loyalty or out of necessity, or perhaps even out of fear of retribution if groups like al-Nusra suddenly gain a lot of influence in the country? And they have said that they would actually work against groups that are not part of the Sunni religious establishment.
Well, I think focusing on the Alawite issue is not really, I think it's a bit misleading. We need to understand that the reason why a lot of Syrians stood with the central government and feared the collapse of a central government is that they do not want a major shift or change in the identity of the Syrian state. We are a secular state, we are a national-based state where everybody is, equal. Moving into a Sunni sort of state or a Sunni sort of identity is pretty much fought against by Sunnis as it is by Alawites or other minorities. We need to understand this. Now, with regards to your guest in Birmingham, I have to disagree a little bit, because I think actually the support for the armed groups or for the opposition may be waning. Actually, he doesn't probably hear a lot of reports of what is happening. But for example, a couple of days ago, there has been a huge massacre in the town of Aqrab, where people were slain. About hundreds of people were slain because they were Alawites, for example. And even moderate opposition figures cannot condone such acts by Muslim extremists. We've seen even mosques being burned because they belong to a Shiite group or whatever. And that really pushes Syrians who were initially looking for more freedom and democracy and so on to question themselves whether have they really taken the right decision to support such groups, and whether should these groups win finally at the ground, whether they will be able to regain their country from their hands. And there is a huge debate that is taking place at the moment in Syria. I'm not claiming that the Syrian government is enjoying a vast majority. Actually, the only poll that was carried out by the Qatar Foundation about a year ago suggested only 55% of support for President Assad, in a sense.
Well, what about the financial cost of this ongoing conflict, though? Because here's another potential reason why the end may be in sight for Syria's government. Many people say it may not be able to afford to keep up the fight for much longer. Before the crisis, the Syrian economy was worth about $60 billion, but a report by the Institute of International Finance estimates it will shrink by 20% this year. The value of the Syrian pound has fallen by half against the dollar, and the report by the IIF says Syria's entire foreign reserves, which have been propping up the economy, could be spent by the end of 2013. Syria's finance minister says next year's budget will be increased by 4%. That's almost $4 billion. Public sector salaries will go up by 13%, and there will be a 25% subsidy on food, fuel, power and agriculture. Inflation is estimated to be running at 40%, and the report says sanctions imposed by the Arab League, the US and the EU in 2011 are also hurting the Syrian economy. Professor Lucas, how much of a factor will this be?
It's a huge factor. The economic squeeze is combined with the gaining of territory by the insurgents and by effectively the loss of political support for Assad, because you can't continue to fight a civil war, and this is a civil war, if you can't continue to finance your military, if you can't continue to finance your businesses, if you can't continue to keep basic services functioning. And it's not just a question of the sanctions. The fact is that Syria's largest city, Aleppo, which up until about 6 months ago was the financial jewel in Syria, the economy has effectively stopped there. And from basically being the part of what should be a thriving state, you actually see people scrambling actually to get basic necessities like food. So even if Assad does not fall because of the military pressure, or even if he doesn't fall because he steps aside because of the peaceful protest, the economic pressure is going to be telling. And to your guest in Moscow, the fact is that the Russians publicly say what he's saying, which is, oh, we still stand by Assad. But what Deputy Foreign Minister Bogdanov revealed, and it wasn't just a discussion, he actually went and said this. He said, look, we recognize the opposition is in a good position to win, and the reason why they're saying that is because their true assessment is that Assad is losing economically as well as militarily.
A lot of questions. We'll have to leave our discussion here, though. Thank you very much indeed to all of our guests. In London, Ammar Waqqaf; in Birmingham, Scott Lucas; and in Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer. And thank you for joining us. A reminder, you can find extensive coverage and reports on the conflict in Syria on our website. That's at aljazeera.com, where you can also view this and other programs on the network. From me, Ghida Fakhry, and the team, thanks for watching.